Good afternoon. I'm Bonna Betcher, Director of Olin and Uris Libraries, and I'm glad to welcome you to our second book talk of the semester. Before I introduce our guest speaker, I would like to share some information about other upcoming events. Next Thursday, October 15th at 4:30 p.m., the Division of Rare and Manuscript Collections will host a book talk in Kroc Library with renowned Norse scholar Nancy Marie Brown, author of the new book, Ivory Vikings, The Mystery of the Most Famous Chessmen in the World and the Woman Who Made Them. Please join us to hear more about medieval Icelandic history and the 12th century Lewis chessmen, which served as models for the movie Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. At the same time, Meredith Martin, Associate Professor of English and Director of the Center for Digital Humanities at Princeton University, will be giving a presentation in this room entitled Counting the Counters, Prosody and Computation, as part of the Conversations in Digital Humanities series. This event is co-sponsored by the Media and Materialisms lecture series. Sam from Buffalo Street Books has copies of today's featured book on the back table. I'm sure Professor Culler will be happy to sign purchased copies. Help yourself to refreshments anytime, and if you would like to receive email announcements about library-sponsored events, please add your name to the clipboard. And now it is my privilege to introduce today's distinguished speaker, Professor Jonathan Culler. A member of the Cornell University faculty since 1977, Culler became the class of 1916 Professor of English and Comparative Literature in 1982. Professor Culler's scholarship has been honored with a number of prestigious awards. To name a few of the many he has received, he has been a Guggenheim Fellow, an NEH Fellow, and an M.H. Abrams Fellow of the National Humanities Center. Professor Culler is an elected Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Philosophical Society. A past president of the American Semiotic Society and trustee of the English Institute, Culler has also twice been a member of the Modern Language Association's Executive Council, a member of the Board of Directors of the American Council of Learned Societies and its current secretary, served on the advisory board of the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, and has been president of the American Comparative Literature Association. He is a senior fellow of the School of Criticism and Theory and served as a director of the Society for the Humanities for 9 years. To suggest that his scholarly oeuvre is substantial is an understatement at best. Culler's list of monographs and edited volumes is a bibliography unto itself, and I'd like to highlight a few. Structuralist Poetics, winner of the Modern Language Association's James Russell Lowell Prize. On Deconstruction, Theory and Criticism After Structuralism, and The Literary in Theory. These are so valued by scholars that each have been translated into many languages and at least one in a pirated edition. His 4 editions of Literary Theory, A Very Short Introduction, Oxford University Press, have been translated into 28 languages and a recording for the blind. Professor Culler has been or is currently an advisory editor or on the editorial board of a number of journals, including PMLA, Diacritics, New Literary History, Poetics Today, Comparative Criticism, Journal of Literary Studies, and the American Journal of Semiotics. Today, Professor Culler will discuss his latest publication, Theory of the Lyric, published by Harvard University Press, in which he explores the Western lyric tradition across millennia, continents, and cultures. Culler challenges us to re-examine what we think we know about the lyric poem and expands our concept of the lyric as a genre. Exploring lyric poetry from Sappho and Horace, Petrarch and Goethe, to Baudelaire, Lorca, and Ashbery, as well as nursery rhymes, Blake, A.A. Milne, William Carlos Williams, and limericks, he ponders how the lyric exists socially, how we acknowledge and respond to its enduring powers of enchantment. Please welcome Professor Culler.
Thank you very much, Bonnie, and thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank all of you. Thanks for coming on this beautiful afternoon. We never know how many of these we're going to have left in Ithaca, so I appreciate your willingness to turn out this afternoon. This is a table of contents, not the structure of my talk, I should say. It's actually an abbreviated table of contents because there's subheadings, but I didn't think they would fit on the slide, but I'll be happy to talk about them or expand any category that you're very interested in. So the plan is for me to talk for about half an hour and then have questions and discussion, so I will try to keep to that. This project originates in my curiosity about strange lyric poems, strange ways of addressing time, the winds, trees, the dead, etc., and asking them to do something or to refrain from doing what they usually do. And from the Greeks to the moderns, poets call upon a universe that they hope will be responsive, and sometimes, of course, their demands do prove seductive. So the question is really, what's going on here? What do these strange ways of speaking tell us about the investments and the ambitions of lyric poetry, and how should we approach it? So back in 40 years ago, 1975, I guess I wrote an essay on the figure called apostrophe, in which the figure of addressing absent entities or basically anything that is not a regular interlocutor, whether the dead or urns or nightingales or sofas or something. In that article, I argued that this strange habit of address was central to the lyric tradition, the epitome of everything that's sort of embarrassing and potential and most daring in the lyric. And that essay is really the seed from which this project grew, though it took 40 years to grow, as it were. It was I didn't realize it at the time, but that essay was actually a break from my new critical training in new criticism. It was no longer oriented by the new critical assumption that poems exist to be interpreted, and that the goal is to produce a more complex and intricate interpretation than anyone has done before. But I didn't realize that I was going off in a different direction. But certainly that essay sought to explore the most unsettling and really intriguing aspects of these poems, and of lyric language, rather than to produce interpretations of the poems. So that work on lyric address provided the foundation for this broader project that materialized in the book published in June by Harvard. There I'm investigating the Western lyric tradition as a whole, an overweening ambition, and attempting to work out really a general framework, a theory of the lyric, I will say, in which attention to those features of lyrics that have been neglected by more current modern models is encouraged and not restricted by these earlier models. Basically, I don't aim to. I'm taking up poems that are the most salient, most famous poems of the Western lyric tradition, and which have all been written about extensively, and not trying to produce more complicated, more brilliant interpretations, but try to register the sorts of pleasures they offer, or the strangeness of their linguistic acts, or to identify really their distinctive rhetorical strategies, and offer some account of the range of historical possibilities for this lyric genre. So lyric poetry has a long history in the West. Yes. But rather an odd and uncertain generic status. Earl Minor, the great Princeton comparatist, concludes that only Western poetics differs from all the others which have made lyric the foundation of their systematic poetics. And he adds that the first thing, he goes on to say that the first thing to be said about lyric poetic systems is that they are not mimetic. So that's my central point for me, that I can argue that Aristotle wrote a treatise because he was writing a treatise on mimetic poetry, poetry as imitation of action and character. He did not write about lyric poetry in the Poetics, even though he was very familiar with current lyric poetry and wrote wrote poems himself, at least one of which got him into trouble at the time. And as a result of the exclusion of those important Greek lyric forms from the poetics, the genre was not really theorized in Western theory for a very long time. It really neglected, even though, in both in Greece, Rome, in the Renaissance, etc., lyric was an important, very important form. It was only in the Romantic period, or at the end of the 18th century, that Western literary thought or literary theory really took cognizance of the lyric. I think my explanation is that a more robust conception of the individual subject made it possible to think of lyric as mimetic, finally, and so bring back Aristotle by the back door, but mimetic of the experience of the individual subject. So it became an expressive model. The lyric is where the subject expresses his or her intense experience. Well, that conception of lyric, the model of lyric as representation of subjective experience, was certainly widely disseminated, very influential, but doesn't have great currency in the academic world today. It really, at least in the Anglo-American academy, it's been more or less replaced by a model of lyric not as mimetic of the experience of the poet, shall we say, but as a representation of the action of a fictional speaker, a persona, as we say, so whose situation readers are supposed to attempt to reconstruct. What is this speaker? Who is the speaker? Here, what is the speaker doing, etc. That was certainly the way I studied poetry as a renegade new critic at Harvard, when the alternative was literary history, and that's a conception of lyric that still informs important textbooks like Helen Wendler's Poems, Poets, Poetry, etc. Students are asked when confronting a poem to work this out. I should have gone to a slide earlier, but so dissatisfaction with both romantic expressive model and the fictional imitation speech act model. It's a basic here. Of course, many great poems in the Western tradition are dramatic monologues, especially in the English tradition. Not so much in the French. The French tradition of dramatic monologue is very different. It's not a mimesis of speech. It's discourse based on the model of sort of French classical drama. So highly ornate speeches by things like serpents, or by les ébauches d'un serpent, or fauns, or Mallarmé, etc. Things of that sort. Not the Browning, not at all the Browning tradition of which gives rise to the possibility of thinking of lyric as essentially an imitation of speech. But the problem, this model, of course, fictionalizes lyric, directs our attention to character and situation, and distracts us from all those elements that are the responsibility of a poet and not of a character, shall we say, created by the poet, and puts us on a novelizing track. Sorry, I've gotten ahead of myself. Where is this? There's Ransom, John Crowe Ransom. I cite John Crowe Ransom because it's really a rather remarkable statement from the new criticism about the notion that that the critical understanding and enjoyment requires that we assume that the speaker is a character and ask what this character and what are the situation that is being assumed. He goes on to say that, in fact, every poem is a dramatic monologue, and finally Browning really created the dramatic monologue and made it possible for us finally to understand what poems really were, what the lawful, what was it, literalize the poem's lawful form. So that's really a pretty extreme. All people who had written poems that didn't have a speaker were really being unlawful because they had not realized what the lawful form of lyric was. So that's sort of I take my enemy here, as it were, the thing that I'm arguing against, and attempting. So the basic impetus of this project is critical, to investigate the inadequacies of these two current models of the lyric, and to explore alternatives, especially, I've sort of not coordinated. The trouble with talking, I'm sort of not coordinated with my slides here that I made. Yes, so the model, anyway, so critique of these two models, less the expressive model than the dramatic monologue model of lyric, and trying to identify alternatives. I mean, the claim is that these models falsify the long tradition of the West of the lyric and encourage students to think about lyrics in ways that neglect some of their most important, most seductive, most characteristic features. So I'm aiming at a more capacious and accurate account of lyric. And I'm not trying to survey all theories of the lyric, but only those that seem particularly promising. And the main alternative is this lyric as epideictic discourse. The argument about Aristotle is that Aristotle didn't include lyric because he thought of it as essentially a form of oratory, the discourse of praise of heroes, praise of the gods, or blame is possible too. But, therefore it was not mimetic. He thought it was not mimetic. And there are a great many poems in the tradition that explicitly are telling us things about the world rather than creating a fictional character. And so that's the sort of more of my default model. There's some other interesting models. There's one called proposal to think of lyrics as thought writing, just as speech writers write speeches for other people to read, so poets engage in thought writing, setting down things for other people to recite, as it were, to perform. Again, an interesting model, not involving fictional characters, but involving a discourse a ritualistic discourse in some sense, to be repeated. So major goal of the project then is to develop a conception of lyric that would be more adequate to the description of lyrics of various, a whole range of periods, and to make possible a better, richer experience of lyric poems. So preventing many poems from becoming just failed examples of dramatic monologue, poems that didn't realize what the lawful form of lyric really should be, as it were. And the second goal is really to combat what I take to be kind of the unnecessary presumption of much lyric theory and pedagogy, that the goal of literary studies is to give rise to new interpretations. I mean, that's really a very recent development in the history of literary pedagogy. It used to be that before the 20th century, students they could imitate poems, they would translate poems, they would memorize, evaluate, etc., to describe the rhetorical figures or the prosodic strategies, but they didn't. I was always struck as a student when I was reading 19th century criticism or something, nobody was actually interpreting. Of course, in those days, it just seemed these were the dark ages. Nobody realized that what you had to do was show how all the parts cohered and gave rise to a complex, paradoxical interpretation, as well. Anyway, but so I think one of the, for me, an alternative model is that of music, or especially of song, that we can develop great connoisseurship, and people, students develop great connoisseurship about music. They know what they like and what they don't like. They know about traditions within the genres that interest them, without spending time trying to interpret individual poems, or the individual songs. That's not not seen as the goal of listening to musical even study of music, is to produce interpretation of individual songs. So I think of that as the kind of model for the sort of engagement with lyric that I'm proposing. I'm not trying to. I should say that I'm not trying to tell people what is a lyric, or how to decide whether something is a lyric or not. I don't have particularly strong views about how which modern poets have succeeded in avoiding writing lyrics. Many don't want to write lyrics, and I'm happy to be a latitudinarian in that area and say, okay, if you really say this is, Kenny Goldsmith does not write lyrics, I will say, but where the line should be drawn, I don't have strong views about. So not the features that I begin with 9 poems from half a dozen languages and periods, and look at ultra-famous poems from Sappho 1, the opening poem of Petrarch's Canzoniere, Baudelaire's A une passante, things of that sort, and ask what are some of the distinctive features of these poems, what are the parameters within which they seem to be operating. And in the book, I'd forgotten that I had narrowed it down. I started out with sort of 7 main parameters or features, but I then in the final revisions for the book, as I discovered as I was checking, I narrowed it down to 4, so because 7 seemed like the wrong kind of number. So, and they're all sort of interconnected, as you will see. So the first is, yes, what I'm calling complexity of the enunciative apparatus. This is not a surprise, since the point of departure was apostrophe, this addressing readers by pretending to address someone else. But I speak often of triangulated address. But I mean, it's striking that even when a poem, there are many poems, of course, that do not address birds or urns or even absent lovers, etc. Poems, if a poem does actually address the reader, seem to say you to the reader, that's rather somewhat unusual and striking. It's clearly that is not the norm for lyric poems. So clearly there's always an indirection. We know that we are being addressed, but always, most of the time, by not being addressed, shall we say. Hence, a complex structure of indirect address, of which apostrophe is only the most blatant version, sort of flaunting it for the whole world. So I'm happy to go back and talk about any of these four parameters. Second, for me, important again in my anti-mimetic hobby horse, as it were. The poem is trying to be an event rather than to be a representation of an event. So various aspects here. Interesting how lyrics often, even though lyrics do contain fictional elements and narration of events, they have many ways of disrupting that narrative dimension. Ballads are always doing it by refrain. So just in case you think this is really a sequential story, we'll keep coming back to the same, repeating the same refrain over and over again. Or strange present tenses that come to dominate the past. You have a little past narrative, but then you get pulled into the present at the end of the poem, for instance. And in general, the whole epideictic function of offering praise or blame or articulating value not via a character or speaker who's being represented. This narrative this is a saying of a formulation of Alice Fulton's that I've transformed a bit. She says narrative is about what happens. I think she says poetry, but narrative is about what happens next. Poetry is about what happens now. So lyric is what. But actually, lots of non-lyric poetry may be about what happens next, in all the times. Okay. Third, lyric is a rhythmic, ritualistic event, something to be repeated. Yes, memorable discourse, that's certainly important. Lyrics often like to try to, Baudelaire says that the genius is to create a cliché, and I must create a cliché, he says. And that's certainly, you measure, to a considerable extent, you measure the success of poems by the extent to which they have succeeded in producing memorable language that sticks in the minds of readers and comes back unbidden, even if you don't remember who did it. Strikingly important for me is the fact that readers temporarily occupy the place of enunciation in lyrics, that the presence, various kinds of rhymes and other sorts of phonetic patterning rely on a subvocalization of the reader, that you have to at least implicitly give voice to the poem in order to see that words that are not spelled the same actually rhyme or something, or connect with one another, things of that sort. Anyway, so the speaker voices the poem. That ritual, I'm calling this the ritualistic domain. Basically, it's everything that is not representational in the poem. So refrains, rhythms, sound patterning, etc. Everything that it could be seen as instructions for performance. And then fourth, again, an unusual quality, seems to me not stressed properly in accounts of poetry, is the hyperbolic quality of lyric. Once again, Baudelaire tells us that apostrophe, and this is probably where I got my start on apostrophe, but hyperbole and apostrophe are the forms of language not only most agreeable, but most necessary to lyric. Apostrophe, hyperbole, you could think, for me, this is not really a scalar quality. It's not that there's hyperbole at one end and down here is the laconic lyric. For me, the laconic lyric is actually as hyperbolic as the hyperbolic lyric. She is all states and all princes I at the one end, and at the other end you have something, I don't know, the apparition of those faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough, which is not saying anything hyperbolic, but because it's a poem, we know this is supposed to be some kind of epiphany, and we've got to work at it to see why is this striking, why is this important. Haiku depends on that entirely, really. The sunlight filters through the trees on the path, a leaf falls. You say, wow, a leaf falls, my God, it's hyperbolic, guys. Anyway, so for me it's not scalar, it's all hyperbole, and that's the defining quality of the genre in some ways, or at least an underlying structure of the genre. Okay, a few more minutes left. Okay, well, I'm not attempting to determine what is or is not a lyric, but I'm asking what's the best model for encouraging capacious appreciation of these poems. And I certainly would say, though my general epidictic model as a sort of default category seems to me a good one. I certainly admit that not all, there's not a simple model that fits all lyrics. Nor, I think, and I want to insist on this, nor can we imagine that the lyric was once one thing and then became something else. One of the curious examples of one of the curious aspects of lyric poetry is that, anyway, things that you see lyrics doing in one period, you will find lyrics doing in another period, whether it's praising the world, bemoaning unhappy love, staging an epiphany, urging the universe to comply with your desires, things of that sort. Those happen all the time. And it's also striking that forms, lyric forms can be revived. Who would have imagined the villanelle to come back in the 20th century as a significant poetic form? We think of historical sort of social and political history as irreversible, but lyric history is not so irreversible. It's very, very uneven. Things can pop up again, etc. So I've been concerned basically to show that each of these two most widespread models is inadequate, and generally to take as my guiding, really a guiding notion, an opposition that I take from Roland Greene's work on the lyric sequence, the tension between what he called the fictional and the ritualistic. It's especially striking in a lyric sequence. If you're reading something like Shakespeare's sonnets, you're searching for. As readers, we want the plot, we want characters and plot, we want to know what's happening, we're looking for the fictional there, but we keep getting frustrated because we keep getting all these quatrains and these rhymes and the imagery, and we can't figure out who the hell who's speaking here, who is this poem about, and what's happening, is there a plot, are they just miscellaneous things? So very true of the lyric sequence, but I think it's also true for the lyric in general. Individual lyrics incorporate fictional elements, whether identifiable speakers or character, as in dramatic monologues, or rudimentary plots, as in ballads, for example, or incidents, most often, of course, just incidents made notable by their insertion in the fundamentally hyperbolic space of the lyric poem. So I'm almost out of time. Let's see. To emphasize, as I have apostrophic address, to sort of put that at the center in some ways, which presupposes an animated world that might be, or at least a potentially animated world that might be asked to act or to refrain from acting. Often poets ask, and when they're very clever, they go on to, they not only ask, as in Lamartine's Le Lac, which is one of the most apostrophic poems around. He starts out by asking time to stop, or quoting his beloved as asking time to stop, and we are told that the lake listens, but time doesn't. Time doesn't pay any attention to that. And by the end, he's succeeding in formulating commands that nature can comply with. Let our love be in the repeated action of the waves on the shore and things like that sort. So the clever poet finds ways to formulate commands that nature can actually comply with without egregious misbehavior, shall we say. Anyway, to stress this aspect of lyric is to link lyric to magic, to the enchantment of the world. that Klaus Molde is finishing a dissertation on, and a world inhabited by sentient forces, a world before the flight of the gods, shall we say. But it's important that I think that it was poets who made this world. It was strikingly, I mean, the Greeks don't have a foundational scripture as Christianity does or as Mohammedanism does, and so it's the poets who basically gave the Greeks their gods. And the society is always confronted with the question of how to imbue matter with, how matter can become sentient, how to imbue matter with spirit and meaning, and poetry is one of the several forces that makes that sort of thing happen and that explicates it. And our sciences do the same, of course, explain how matter can be sentient, how a spirit can arise from an organism of flesh and blood and bone, etc. And so we have different ways of imbuing a world of forces and magnitudes with meaning, direction, action, and lyric is the bolder, more abrupt, more sort of disjunctive way of doing this than many other forms, in lieu of argumentation and demonstration, shall we say. Okay, so to stress, as I have done, the fundamentally hyperbolic character of lyric is to underline the sort of the flagrancy of lyric operations that makes them both always vulnerable to dismissal, but also makes the poems themselves acutely attentive to their own vulnerability. And poems that boldly demand action, as I've suggested, often are skeptical about their powers to achieve that. Keats, was it a vision or a waking dream at the end? After this bold poem, you draw back and ask, did anything happen? What's going on here? So as they evoke possible relations to the universe, they explore what kinds of demands might succeed. They take risks, but they court embarrassment with figures that can always be dismissed as ridiculous or overweening, etc. But it's a risk they acknowledge and often make their most intimate theme. Anyway, let's see, one last point. As I mentioned music before, as a possible model for thinking about, or trying to think not so much about the poems themselves, but about our possible potential relations to a body of work, and something that we should be able to attend to our pleasure while also gaining confidence in our ability to appreciate what the things that secured our attention, which is certainly the way we work with music. Poets don't demand interpretation of readers, but they expect what Coleridge called poetic faith, that their statements require no supplementation, at least for the duration of a reading. So that the duration of a reading is the lyric event, and I think that's something one needs to keep in view, especially in an academic context. Susan Stewart writes, on a quotation I'm fond of, "I propose that the sound of poetry is heard in the way a promise is heard. Right? That a promise is an action made in speech, something that happens, right? That occurs as an event and can be continually called upon, called to mind in the unfolding present." So the point is that poems are not recalled as a fact is recalled, say, but as she says, they're registered as able to be recalled, as able to be uttered or experienced again, even if you only remember a few of the words, or sometimes, quite maddeningly, only some poetic rhythm that you can't get out of your head. So, notion of lyric sound as promise, I think, points to the value to which lyric especially ministers, which is the love of these sonorous phrases, the memorable formulation. Whether it's the expression of an attitude, like I fall upon the thorns of life, I bleed, or whether it's just an elegant piece of sonority that I've always found particularly useless, like the moan of doves in immemorial elms, for example, my famous Tennyson example. These phrases, Paul Valéry says that such phrases create the need to be heard again, and that's part of my ritualistic aspect of lyric, the sounds that create the formulations that create the need to be heard again. So at one point in this book, in the last chapter of the book, I said a little bit jokingly, I guess, that lyrics really speak of people's tendency to use lyrics as sort of smorgasbords of truth, that they pick out what they want and repeat those things. And that's partly true. But they're not buffets of truths only. They're also found in poems. There are all sorts of phrases, especially indeed the unimaginable ones that stretch the imagination, offering us experiences of pleasure and of puzzlement as we speak them to ourselves and occasionally to others as well. So, thank you very much. I'm sorry I forgot about my... I completely forgot my slides. Here's the poetics rather than hermeneutics. Other things we can talk about. Notions of lyric as a defense against historicistic critiques. Anyway, if there are other things to talk about, or I can go back to the table of contents. I don't know, what did I have up here first? Yeah. Questions? Yeah, Ernesto.
Jonathan, thanks for your talk. So with the notion that lyric is the fictional imitation of speech, you can also say that lyric is a fictional imitation of thought. With that in mind, what would the epic lyric, what would that address, or what would the epic lyric's function would be, taking the imitation, the fictional imitation of speech or thought, keeping that in mind?
Epic lyric. Well, epics are characteristically narrative poems. So for me, they really don't. I don't have a category of the epic lyric, but they would be, if you want to attempt to. I mean, Barbara Herrnstein-Smith, whom I didn't give you a slide, she's one of the few people who's actually tried to theorize this notion of lyric as an imitation speech of a real fictional imitation of a real-world speech act. And she says, that novels are imitation biographies, and that lyric is an imitation of what she calls personal utterance. So, I don't know, epic would be what a fictional. A verse imitation of storytelling or something of that sort. I'm not quite sure. I'm not very fond of it, as I indicated. I want to resist that notion of lyric as an imitation. I mean, for very many lyrics, if you ask what is as Helen Bedler asked in one of the things she asked students to do, and I don't want to criticize Helen Bedler. She has many also very good things to say and is one of our best critics of poetry. But at one point she says that for students that you should think about in what situation you would say this and what you would be meaning if you said this. But of course, for very many lyrics, the only answer to a question like that, what would you be doing if you were saying this? You would be waxing poetical or something. You would be saying something outrageous that no one would ever say. Cloud, puffball, torn tufts, tossed pillows, flaunt forth, and Chevy in an air-built thoroughfare. In what circumstance would I say that? Never. Only if I'm reciting a poem, right? There are very many lyrics like that. So I resist the imitation speech act model. There are lyrics where poets obviously do set out to imitate speech. I mean, Frost does this. Frost is quite good at that. And for example, there are many that don't. That are undertaking that the speech act is really a poetic speech act rather than an imitation of a discourse in a particular non-fictional situation. Yeah, Jenny.
I have my question. I'm excited by your working against this.
Oh, sorry. Do we have to? Is it for recording? Or is it for hearing people, or is it for the recording? Okay, so if you want posterity to hear your question,
Testing,
wait for
1,
the
2,
microphone.
3. No, I'm excited by your easing poetry out of this box, this narrative box, fiction, dramatic speaker box. But I wonder about the reasons, perhaps the reasons that, it has seemed to me a reason to introduce a poem as a kind of dramatic monologue is to encourage readers or students not to judge and dismiss the poem as you're saying, it's vulnerable, it's hyperbolic. So it's like, I've fallen the thorns of life, I bleed. Blake's a dork, It's like, how do you encourage people to see
Shelley.
Joni's a dork.
Shelley,
sorry. But how do you encourage people to have more, distance, critical distance? And how ways will do that?
Well, I mean, I think critical distance is a special, particular academic virtue. That there's circumstances in which you want to encourage that, but not always. I think after all, one of the things that the this audience is obviously an exceptional group, but one of the things we do battle against is students, the assumption of many students that they don't like poetry, or and they don't want to study poetry, and that may be because they've been asked to both to take a distance from it, rather than treat it as rap lyrics that they're going to speak to themselves while they go around campus or something, and also because they've been they've been told that the goal is to interpret, and that often seems like guessing what the teacher has in mind. What's this poem really about, as we say in English classes, right? And so I think I don't. It's fine. Yes, obviously, if you're a critic writing a book on something, it's good to have a certain distance on it, that you're not just getting carried away. And also, of course, people often write books about things that they think are interesting topics, even though they're not deeply enamored of this particular body of verse or fiction. So in those academic circumstances, it can be important. Yeah, you're right. I mean, obviously one reason for adopting that model is to just break the link between the I of a poem, or the speaker speaks, so the discourse of a poem, and the biographical author. But you can do that in other ways. I'm interested in Kata Hamburger, a German critic, has a model in which is the only one I've really found that's very explicitly says there's fiction over here, and then there's lyric over here, that it's different, and that the relation between the lyric I and the biographical I is indeterminate by definition. It can be close, can not be close, but that's then makes it a sort of matter for individual decision from one moment to another, and I'm perfectly content with that. I used to be a purist about, we had to say the narrative, the speaker or something, instead of saying Wordsworth or Baudelaire or something like that says this. And but we know when we say Baudelaire says such and such, and this, that's already a sort of figure, a kind of metonymy for but anyway, I'm not really deeply. That's one of the great big motives for the dramatic monologue model in the Anglo-American tradition, to not lead us down the biographical, not to assume that if you're studying poetry, you should go off and read the life of the author to try to find out what it really means. But you can do that by just focusing on the reader and say that the crucial thing is how does this work for us today, as opposed to what might have led the author to say this, as it were. But a lot of poems do say things about the world. George, I'm sorry, do you want to keep track of who's, because I forget who's been raising
Thank you
their
very
hand.
much,
Okay.
Jonathan.
Yes.
I have a question about the hyperbole and embarrassment. So you mentioned hyperbole as one of your 4 parameters,
Yeah.
and I guess we would agree with me that some lyrical poems are hyperbolic to the point of impossibility, sometimes absurdity. Lamartine, you mentioned autant suspend ton vol et vous suspendez votre cours. It always struck me as a completely illogical poem. For how long is the time going to stop, given that the poem itself operates in time, and even to enjoy the best memories, you need time, etc. So is this what you find embarrassing? You use that term, that when the poem exceeds its own program, in a sense? Or is there something else? I'm asking also because your student works on embarrassment, and it's still difficult for me to grasp that notion. What do you find embarrassing in lyrical poems?
Yeah. Well, that's a good question. It's it's certainly, Baudelaire has a poem which puts on stage a poet who goes around complaining to nature, and it's a poem that makes fun of the poet who, comme je me plaignais à la nature, it was a beautiful day, but I was out there. I'm a poet, so I was complaining to nature and casually sharpening the blade of my dagger against my heart, and so he's the poet, and then some demons start mocking him as this. Who is this? The guy he thinks he's Hamlet, etc. Walking around complaining, etc. So that's the poetic posture of complaining to nature, expecting nature to respond to you, is one that is embarrassing, right? Seems foolish, ridiculous. So I'm not using embarrassing in any particular sense, and it's not so much that I'm embarrassed, though. When I wrote the apostrophe essay and was going around giving lectures on apostrophe, I enjoyed what I felt to be the risk of apostrophizing in front of an audience and saying now, of course, that's more, I mean, Barack Obama started, Cleveland, you know, I love you all, or something, I love you. It sort of started apostrophizing an audience in that way. But it was a bit, you know, a bit awkward, and you know, it's not the right academic distance to start declaiming, and you know, you have to say, I'm now going to quote this poem, and sort of just start out apostrophizing. So anyway, there is embarrassment connected with that, exceeding the bounds of regular, normal, acceptable conduct. Let's put it that way. The poet is him. You know, we have lots of images. The poet who's the one who has his head in the clouds and who doesn't know what he is doing foolish things. So that's. I'm sorry, I don't know if that helps. Yes.
Hi. So I was wondering, in defining one of the main traits of the poetical word in lyrical poetry, you use the term presentification at some point, I think, and say that there is not a difference between you know, the world and the words, but the words are the world in a way. The words create the event. And in doing that, you seem to exclude that those words are talking about the world. They are not constitutive prepositions.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, what do you think about those lyrical compositions? I'm thinking about Cavalcanti or Guinizelli. They make explicit claims of telling the truth. For example, Voglio del ver la mia donna laudata, like I want to praise the truth.
Yes.
Or Cavalcanti when he says that he's going to give a natural demonstration of what love is in one of his main compositions. So I'm like, there is a dimension in which lyrical composition also want to talk about reality and truth. So
yes,
how
indeed.
do you...
No, that's absolutely central for me, and I probably shouldn't have put the word performative up there on one of the slides, because I am skeptical. I mean, there's the ways in which the notion of performative is attractive because it's not representational, shall we say. It's the lyric as event. But certainly the whole whole epideictic model of lyric is lyric as making claims about the world, making statements about the world. And I think very large numbers of lyrics do that. You know, even poets like Frost do it all the time. You can decide that it's being done in an ironic way or something of that sort. But I don't know. Make the whole stock exchange your own. If need be, occupy a throne so nobody can call you crone. Better to go down dignified with boughten friendship at your side than none at all. Provide. That's the end of a Frost poem called Provide. So, we can say that's ironic, and we can imagine somebody speaking it, but I think, and try to think who is speaking it in what circumstance. But no circumstances are given, really. It's a sort of a sardonic articulation of a view about the world that you need to provide, and that's it's a cynical account of the world. But there are many poems of that sort that are making explicit claims about the world and not recounting what happened to a speaker or something of that sort. And so it's not, for me, there's not a contrast between the poems. I mean, I'm not suggesting, Auden has a sentence, a sentence uttered makes a world appear where all things happen as it says they do, I haven't got it quite right, all things happen as it says they do. And that can be true, too, but I certainly don't. I think the notion of the performative is really the name of a problem rather than a solution to thinking about lyric structure, because precisely that reason, as you say, that poems are present-oriented in the sense that they are there to be repeated over and over again. And in English, we have this very interesting, this unusual tense, this non-progressive present tense for actions, which other languages don't have. Which immediately sort of identifies a poem. You're in a poem, either a poem or you're listening to a foreigner or something. I walk through the long schoolroom questioning. If you say that, that's poetry, because if we were just talking, we would say, I am walking through the schoolroom questioning, or you would say, I walk through the long schoolroom questioning every Thursday, or you'd have to have a temporal modifier or something. So it's this particular non-progressive present tense with actions is a distinctively lyric tense. I think that this is something that happens over and over again at every moment when the lyric says now. So that was my emphasis on the now of the lyric. It's but that now can be a moment at which a truth about the world is being uttered. Yeah, it's not. It does not that the performative dimension does not mean that you're not trying to utter truths. But I'll cross out the word performative because that can mislead. Yeah.
Yeah, I find this a very attractive theory. I love your emphasis on the ritualistic and so forth, and the magical, enchanting the world. I'm wondering if you do anything with the riddle aspect of lyric poetry. That's so common.
Yeah, I have some Emily Dickinson examples certainly that are of interest, but it's true. It's mostly the notion of riddle mostly comes up in Northrop Frye. In my chapter called Lyric Structures, I'm interested in the various oppositions that ideally lyric structures would have ended up in mapping the domain of lyric, but that's too hard, and Frye didn't succeed, and he tried harder than I did, and I can't succeed either. So, but there are a lot of oppositions that are at work in past and present, etc., things of that sort. And one of Frye talks about babble and doodle as, and he associates doodle with riddle, and the riddling lyrics, etc. And that's certainly an important dimension of lyric for me too, but not nearly as important for Frye. So no, I mean, lyrics. But certainly lyrics can pose those are poems that do demand. They ask you to interpret. There are lots of, especially. I mean, Emily Dickinson is I don't know enough medieval lyrics to where there are said to be lots of these riddles and. But with Emily Dickinson, certainly there are many poems where the goal is to find the solution. What is this about? This is about snow, or this is about, etc. Yeah. Yeah, Paul. Okay.
Back to hyperbole.
Hyperbole. Okay.
So one way of talking about modernist poetry is that it's anti-poetic in the sense that it attempts to flatten, right? To sound like Frost. When people say to me that my poems sound like prose, that's right. That's just how I want them to sound like. And so there appears to be no difference between lyric speech and prose. Or think of a real blankly quiet line like "Ta'en by Milltown, we lay on mother's bed," and so on. Now I'll accept your the range of hyperbole from over here to the imagistic, that helps me with, for example, so much depends upon a red wheelbarrow. That's, all right, that's hyperbole, but how would you claim that any lyric whatsoever is hyperbolic, or even the very, very flat language is, in some sense, hyperbolic? If you
no, for all of these dimensions of lyric, I'm really claiming that what I'm claiming is that here's the underlying structure, and then obviously people can defeat these structures in various ways. They can have all kinds of fictional elements in there. You can try to escape the hyperbolic dimension of lyric, but the harder you try to, often there's a sort of middle ground of the mimesis of speech, which Frost succeeds in very well, which may escape hyperbole. Though if you try too hard, then it becomes this minimalist thing where you're just quoting a conversation, and the question is, so what? And you either say, so what, or you say, wow, yeah, I guess this is something important about human life, and you invest it with a hyperbolic significance. But there is a sort of middle ground, I agree, where you have a poem of poetry of speech. But often, Frost too, there's a lot of intensity. I don't know. I have been one acquainted with the night. It's easy flow the numbers, as it were, but that's still got a, especially when you repeat, as soon as you get repetition, And so Stopping by Woods is a good example. If you didn't have the repetition and miles to go before I sleep, you'd say, this is a little anecdote, and so what? But miles to go before I sleep. With the repetition, you say, wow, what is this? What's going on here? This is important. Sleep must be death, etc. You go off in those lyric pathways, as it were.
I've been told this is the last one, so I'll try not to make it too disappointing. Okay. But if you thumb through any number of contemporary poetry collections over the last, I'd say 10 to 20 years, you see sprinkled throughout, and sometimes more than sprinkled, quite a few prose poems. And I've gotten to the point, just from my own thinking, where I've begun to think of the prose poem as a form of a lyric poem. But looking at some of your characteristics, the ritualistic being one of them, the lack of prosodic structure to the prose poem. I'm just wondering what place the prose poem has in your cosmology or your theory.
None at
of the
all.
lyric.
None at all.
Really?
No, and this I speak as a lover of Baudelaire, but for me that it really is a different thing, the prose poem, and I don't want to include it in the lyric, even though there I just do draw a line. I said it's doing something different. It's avoiding aspects of the lyric, trying to do something else, and trying to evade before they had invented other ways of evading lyric modes. But that's just a decision. I think it's a motivated decision, but it's not. Yeah, that was an easy question. I could have a harder one.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
Please
very
join
much.
me in
Yep.
thanking
Okay.
Professor
Okay.
Culler again.
Okay.